Hi everyone, I have a very quick tutorial today on how to set up Cloudflare workers. Cloudflare, I recently added that into one of my projects and loved how easy to set up and deploy, also convenient it is. So decided to share this. And Cloudflare workers basically are like serverless functions. As I mentioned, you can easily deploy them, and then Cloudflare handles the infrastructure, so you don't have to worry about it as long as the code you test is working. You get a URL of your deployment, and you can integrate into your apps or any third-party application APIs that you are trying to connect to. And the best use case of this is to, let's say, trigger some actions from one application to another, or to interact with some of Cloudflare services. For example, they have a Cloudflare AI and also Cloudflare queues, which actually I'm going to cover in the next video, so make sure to check that out as well. Now going back to the first use case that I mentioned, which is connecting different systems together and using the Cloudflare workers. Let's go over the example of the systems that I connected in my project, and I'll also show my worker simultaneously. But if you want to create a worker to follow a tutorial, you're gonna need Cloudflare account. You can sign up on their website. Once you create an account and log in, you'd be redirected to this dashboard page that looks like this. And also, I think some understanding of JavaScript is needed to write the code and logic for workers, even for like a different use case. Doesn't have to be exactly the same as mine. But here is the worker that I'm talking about for my project. Once I click on it, I can see some metrics, analytics, and some numbers. And if I go to edit code, which this is a simple code, so I just wrote directly in their console. And what this does is in a request, it gets the data about user, and I'm taking the data, specifically the email address, and I'm sending it to Beehiiv API. Beehiiv is what I use for a newsletter service. And to be able to access the Beehiiv, I needed to get the API, publication ID API key, which I stored then inside my Cloudflare environment variables. And it is like a secure way of storing. You can do that to store sensitive information. And then send this data to the Beehiiv. Also, besides email, I include other like campaign names and things like that. And another great thing that we can do is we can check the method using Cloudflare, what kind of method when someone makes an API call is. I only allow post methods, and if it's not a post method, we can always return error. So now I guess I do have the deployment URL, which you can see here, and would be what service is calling this API, like deployment URL. And this would be webhooks that I configured in Clerk. Clerk is what I use for some of my projects as an authentication provider. So using Clerk SDK, I authenticate users on the web apps that I built. And they also have an option, just like with a lot of like services have, once I like select the project that I want to configure my webhook to. In the settings here, we have a webhook option, and there's an event catalog, so webhook could be triggered on the events that you configure to. So for me, I only did email created. And then in the endpoints, we actually indicate the deployment URL, whether or not you're using Cloudflare worker, of where your serverless function is deployed. So anytime this event, which is email creation, happens from the clerk would call my serverless function, that's a Cloudflare worker, and then this would do the logic here and call the Beehiiv and add the users in the newsletter. So I think this is like the simplest way to configure this, like two APIs, webhook and an API of another service working together. And let's create a new worker now to see how exactly we can do that step by step. So I'll go back to workers and pages overview page where I will create a new, there's some templates that you can pick from that already has the code added. I'll create a hello world example and let's deploy that. So it's a very simple example that responds out hello world. So now the project is deployed and there's a few things we can do from here. There's a Wrangler CLI, which is for you to be able to write the code locally on your machine and use the CLI to push it. We can go first to the edit code and see how that works. So over here, calling a get method. So even if you call this, copy this URL, and if we were to call from our browser, even here, we're gonna get like the response back since it is already deployed. Okay, now let's get the search parameters from the URL and we're gonna destructure constant search params equals new URL, and then we pass request that's inside the fetch here, the URL. This should return if there's any parameters, and then we can console log it, which we should be able to see. I'm just gonna reconnect real quick inside the console here. To save this change, we need to deploy, and that's our deploy button. Version saved. Let's hit the request, and we don't have any parameters because I haven't updated the URLs. So if I do something like action equals to subscribe and press go, I'll see the size got updated, but we don't see what the value of the action is, the parameter action is. We subscribe, so let's get that value. And before we do that, if you enjoy my tutorials and they've been helpful, make sure to click the subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow. So let's get the name of the action. So let action equals to search params, and we use the get function. Here we pass the value, which is action. So inside the console log, let's just display the action. I'm gonna deploy it real quick. And let's call that one more time. So yep, we do have subscribe here now. And if we wanted to update the response as well and send the action data back, we don't have to necessarily print out a string. It could be JSON, or let's see, first let's modify the string and then I'll show how to display JSON. Then we call this action variable, quick deploy, and let's call this, the action is subscribe. And to return the response, we have to add this JSON function and pass the action like this. Remove the new keyword. So let's deploy. And we see our JSON coming back. Let's say you are creating a waitlist for a product that you'll be launching soon, and you want to get this list of emails for users that would want to try it out and notify them somehow. You don't need to create a waitlist application. If world's first AI engineer doesn't engineer also separate application, uses Google Forms to collect those emails, as Pragmatic Engineer pointed out, you can do the same, and you can add the serverless function, the workers, to trigger and send the data somewhere. And even for the data, you don't need to necessarily build a database you can send to your maybe newsletter provider, create a separate audience for it, like I would do in a Beehiiv. And then once the product is ready, send the email for it. Or same thing with like a resend, which is email sending service. You can send emails directly from your React apps. And I will also actually be using resend for a newsletter application tutorial that I'm working on. And once it's ready, I would include the video link in the description. But yeah, let's see how we can add our function or worker as a webhook to Google Forms. I'm gonna go into Google Forms in my Google dashboard and create. Let's do a blank form. Launch the first tester of XYZ newsletter. Let's do just one field, short answer. All right, and this is require. And now if we go to the settings, actually Google Form does not have a webhook where we can just directly add the URL and call it. But it does have a script editor, which is basically another function. And in here, we can update this function to call our serverless function. So you take all of the responses and send it to our function as a post request. And I'm gonna update this with the URL. So let's post that here. And later on, we're gonna update the function to also take in the payload, because right now we're just getting the parameters from the URL. Okay, so let's deploy this, new deployment type, API executable. Let's save. In the menu, we should have triggers, and we're gonna set up so when the form is submitted, we trigger this function. All right, add a trigger. On submit, this is one function that we have, so if we click on this, it only shows up. And event type, we don't want on open, we just want on for form submit. Let's save that. Let's fill out the form, submit. And go to executions, and we can see the first time I ran, it didn't contain any responses. So we can see that it has been completed, and we can also log the answer we get from here. But first, let's update the worker so that we are able to get this information of the responses coming in. So I'm going to remove this request URL parameters. We're not using that. We're just going to be getting the data from the body actually. And to do that, like previously I did, I'll do constant data equals to request.json, and we can return the data back. Let's also update to console log. I'm going to deploy this. Should be await data because this is a promise. So let's deploy. And if we go back, we can also see that there are logs, and we can turn on like a live log. So it would print out all the logs that are coming in. So now if I submit this form, we should be seeing the log. So I'm going to go back to, where's this URL? Okay, and I'm just gonna submit. Your response has been recorded. Let's go back to Cloudflare, and we can see that there was a post method made to this URL. All right, so we got a request, and in the logs we have a message and an array that says email as a email field, and then other information about the request. So we only need to access the message and the email. So let's modify our worker field. Let's go back our edit code. And inside the data, we can get the email field since it was payload logs and it was an array. And we want message and the first field email. Let's deploy this, test this out here, and we can enforce. So from preview, it only adds, it only sends a get method. Sends a request using a get method, but we can also make this only accept post request. So it would be let method, since we're getting the data in that way, equals to request, and let's check it, if method to post, then do the rest of it, and else we're gonna return new response that says method not allowed. And it would be status 405. All right, so let's send a post request. And if this is not true, we return response that says method not allowed. Let's deploy it. Okay, so if we paste the object that's coming in from Google's script, I'm just trying to replicate that. It does have other fields, but we're only interested in the logs. There's an array, message field, and test email. And if we just rerun the game, we're going to see that in the console log here, we do get a test email. A lot of other services that you connect this data to. For example, you connect it to the Discord server and send a message like new user signed up. You can like email it to your sales team, maybe if they want to reach out, or like I do, you can add it to your Beehiiv newsletter and then send out a newsletter once the product is ready. And for that, you need a Beehiiv account, and you also need an API key, which we're going to save it into an environment variables. To get the API key, you need to log in first. Then there's an integrations page, and there's a button to create new API key. Once you create those, there's two ways of adding environment variables in Cloudflare workers. One is using Wrangler, their CLI tool, but you can also, since we did most of the things in configuration, you can also configure that from the dashboard, and it would be inside settings. I'm gonna close this out, and here we have variables and secrets. If I click to add and give variable name, for example, first one would be Beehiiv publication ID, and paste your value here. We would have to, so I'm gonna say version first. Add another one, and this would be Beehiiv API key. All right. So you actually paste your value here, and what I would recommend is, these are not my actual values, and click encrypt so this data is stored safely. Going back to our code, what we can do is, once we get the email, we can make a request to the Beehiiv, and this is per their documentation, which I can also link in the description under developers.beehiiv.com. We're gonna call a create subscription API endpoint, which by passing publication ID, it creates a new subscription for the publication. So basically adds the user there. And also if you decide to subscribe to my newsletter, that is what I'm using, sharing the news of different things that I build and tutorials I'm using Beehiiv for, I'm gonna also link that in the description if you do decide to sign up for the Beehiiv, sign up on Beehiiv, also use the link, I'll share that as well. And this would be the code for creating subscription. We can examine it if we select here. Where's Node? Oh. Okay, let's try TypeScript. Oh, they have a Beehiiv client. Okay, we're just gonna use, I'm not gonna use their client, but we're gonna make a request to publications. Here is where we're using environment variables, and we're calling subscriptions endpoint method equals post. That's what they're accepting as well. Authorization, there comes our API key. And inside here, as an email field, we pass the email that comes in here. This source, I'm gonna say Cloudflare workers tutorial. And we probably don't need referring. These are also optional, so you can just comment out all these fields and it would like still work. Only field required obviously is like email, and I don't know what's going on here. So that should be good. Let's try it out in the body. First we'll test here, and then I'll submit the Google form and see if that adds to my Beehiiv. So I'll just change the email, and that would be let's send the request. Oh, and then it did return the response that it was created. All right. We don't need the logs messages. We can try with just an email. So let's deploy a form now. Where's my submit and not response? test1@gmail.com. Let's do submit. All right, let's go to my Beehiiv. I'm gonna see this email that I just added, and also as an acquisition source that I updated to Cloudflare workers tutorial. All right, that would be it for this tutorial. So we went over how to set up a simple worker, how to get the URL params, or how to check the methods for the requests that are coming in, also how to take the data from the request using body, and also how to return different either error or data back. And that would be it. Make sure to check out my next tutorial in which we'll be building queues using workers.